different than mechanical failures in there. So in addition to what you have there, include improperly performed maintenance.
Unless someone sees an objection to that, I'm adding improperly performed maintenance after mechanical failures here. All right? Other comments on this? All right, then if there are no further comments on the findings as edited, and there are changes now in number 8 and number 9, could I have a motion to accept the findings as edited and presented? May I have a second?
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Any opposition? It passes unanimously. All right, and then I'd like to move, if I could please, to the recommendations themselves. Oh, I'm sorry, I should move to the probable cause. My apologies. The probable cause of this accident is as follows. The National Transportation Safety Board determines that the probable cause of the uncontrolled flooding and sinking of the Miss Majestic was the failure of Land and Lake Tours Incorporated to adequately repair and maintain the duck. Contributing to the sinking was a flaw in the design of the ducts, that is, the lack of adequate reserve buoyancy that would have allowed the vehicle to remain afloat in a flooded condition. Contributing to the unsafe condition of the Miss Majestic was the lack of adequate oversight by the Coast Guard. Contributing to the high loss of life was a continuous canopy roof that entrapped passengers within the sinking vessel or vehicle. Comments on the probable cause?
Yes, thank you. I have one proposed suggested change in the probable cause. Line 16, we say contributing to the sinking was a flaw in the design of ducts. I wonder if it would be more accurate to say ducts converted to passenger use or ducts as converted, because it seems to me the original design was pretty good, and this was not considered a flaw. Would that be acceptable?
I agree with that.
Okay.
It's really, they designed it that way. That's not a flaw.
Right.
Aye.
Okay.
I totally agree.
What was the wording again?
I'd suggested the design of ducts as converted for passenger use.
Any other comments on the probable cause? All right. Then if I could have a motion to adopt the probable cause as revised. And a second, I presume. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed. The probable cause has been adopted as revised. All right, and then if we could move now to the recommendations, and I will read these, and again, ask that you stop me if there are questions, clarifications, and edits. There are before us 3 recommendations that are to the Coast Guard and the governors of the states of New York and Wisconsin, and 1 recommendation specifically to the Coast Guard. I'll go to the first recommendations to the U.S. Coast Guard and the governors of the states of New York and Wisconsin. Number 1, require that amphibious passenger vehicle operators provide reserve buoyancy through passive means, such as watertight compartmentalization, built-in flotation, or equivalent measures, so that the vehicles will remain afloat and upright in the event of flooding, even when carrying a full complement of passengers and crew. Number 2, until such time that owners provide sufficient reserve buoyancy in their amphibious passenger vehicles so that they will remain upright and afloat in a fully flooded condition, by recommendation number 1, require the following. Number 1, this is a subset, removal of canopies for waterborne operations. 2, re-engineering of each amphibious vehicle to permanently close all unnecessary access plugs and to reduce all necessary through-hull penetrations to the minimum size necessary for operation. 3, installation of independently powered electric bilge pumps that are capable of dewatering the craft at the volume of the largest remaining penetration to supplement either an operable Higgins pump or a dewatering pump of equivalent or greater capacity. 4, installation of 4 independently powered bilge pumps.
Excuse me, I
Yep.
wanted to interrupt at that point with the question. It may be obvious to others, but I was curious about why 4. I'm sure there's a reason for 4 powered bilge alarms.
Yes, Madam Vice Chairman. The independently powered bilge alarms are in fact something that we felt would provide the alarm that was not provided for the Miss Majestic. And even though the Coast Guard has said that they want bilge alarms, the single activation of one bilge alarm would not necessarily create an environment such that everybody would immediately put on their life jackets and jump overboard. So we felt that we wanted to have more than one, and the independent power was so that you would not have them in such a circuit that if you lost one, you would lose them all.
If I might, Vice Chairman Carmody, the determination of the number 4 is in the Coast Guard NAVIC. That was their suggestion.
I have a question about how you would achieve 4 independent power systems. Are you talking about like an aircraft with 4 generators and 4 backup power systems, 4 backup battery systems?
Sure. Why couldn't you have battery-powered backup systems on
4
these?
generators or alternators?
Sure.
If I might, my expectation was that these were battery powered, and that whether the maintenance of the battery would come through an alternator system or whether they would be separately maintained as a maintenance item, I don't know. But 4 generators, I don't know that was within the contemplation. I can look down the table if that was within the contemplation of staff. I didn't find it in the NAVIC.
They have the option of whichever choice they would like.
Okay. Just a question.
Number 5, again, in the subset of recommendation 2, is inspection of the vehicle in water after each time a through-hole penetration has been removed or uncovered. Number 6, verification of a vehicle's watertight condition before each waterborne departure. And 7, compliance with all remaining provisions of Navigation and Vehicle Inspection Circular 101. Then the 3rd recommendation, again, to the U.S. Coast Guard as well as the governors of the states of New York and Wisconsin. Number 3, where canopies have been removed on amphibious passenger vehicles, require that all passengers don life jackets before beginning waterborne operations. The final recommendation is to the U.S. Coast Guard alone. Develop and promulgate guidance for all amphibious passenger vehicles similar in purpose to the Navigation and Vehicle Inspection Circulator 1-01. That concludes the recommendations. Are there other comments on these? Member Hammerschmidt.
Yes, concerning the recommendation number 2, the first item, right before we began going through the conclusion, someone up here crafted an option on this which says removal of canopies for waterborne operations or installation of a Coast Guard approved canopy that does not restrict vertical escape by passengers in the event of sinking. Read that again. Number 1 would be require the following: removal of canopies for waterborne operations or installation of a Coast Guard approved canopy that does not restrict vertical escape by passengers in the event of sinking. When I read that, it looked pretty good. So, Mr. Henry.
Just one thought on that one. Are we saying that the Coast Guard can still condone restricting the sideway escape of passengers in an emergency? If you leave the canopy intact and try and meet the provision as written, you really haven't said anything or done anything different about egress over the side in the horizontal direction. I guess that brings me back to the
How
point.
about just taking out the word vertical in that case? I was actually reading, I was misconstruing vertical whenever I first saw this. I haven't had time to study it, but I was thinking of vertical as being the clearance that you need on the sideway escape, but I guess it is crafted.
I think the intent is that you would
Right.
float out of it.
What if you said in regard to this proposed alternate that it just does not restrict escape by passengers in the event of sinking? If the Coast Guard had an improved canopy.
I think the word vertical in this case, in fact, is a critical factor because, and I believe it was actually in Mr. Henry's presentation when he was talking about the size of the openings horizontally, the implication is that if you get off the vessel before it sinks, then the horizontal egress is clearly an advantage. Our concern is that you will not get off the vessel before it sinks, and then it is the vertical escape that becomes the critical aspect. And so I would say
Vertical
that the
is-
word vertical, in fact, is a critical word in there.
It's where it should be, yes. Does that sound agreeable to staff?
I have one dissension. For the comments previously given, I think that the vessels can be made, cannot be made safe by common operators. That we do not need to go to this extra step of requiring the canopies to be removed in any form. The those alarms, the dewatering pumps, the double clamp boots, restrictor plates, these are all things that should give the operator of the vessel adequate time to react to an emergency and to know about it. So it would seem like that there's no requirement for removing the canopy in my mind.
Okay.
Are there other comments on this point? Otherwise, Member Hammerschmidt, are you moving this language then?
Yes, I can.
All right.
It looks good to me.
I might make one other suggestion on it, if I might. The phrase is removal of canopies for waterborne operations or installation of a Coast Guard approved canopy that does not restrict. Perhaps to speak to the issue staff raised, we could say either horizontal or vertical escape by passengers in the event of a sinking. All right. With that change, then, that would be the recommendation of Member Hammerschmidt. Is there a second on this? So moved. All right. Then we will vote on that recommendation specifically here as we move forward. Are there any other suggested changes, though? Perhaps we can consider these all at once before moving forward on it.
Well, I would just like to express my concerns again that although we have stepped out in several areas further than the Coast Guard, and justly so, I believe, I'm still concerned that we haven't stepped up to the plate to fully address the maintenance involvement in this accident and the other two that are represented. When I read through the Coast Guard's NAVIC, there's still no requirement for a maintenance manual. There's an operations manual, there's a checklist required, there's no retention of records required, and there's no oversight of the process. And I would like to remind staff that both of the mechanics that were involved in the maintenance misadventures for the Miss Majestic were contract employees. They were not employees of the company, and there was absolutely no oversight of their activities. And that is simply unacceptable risk in my mind.
All right. Thank you, John. I take it there's no specific recommendation you're making other than wanting to put the comment on record. Is that correct?
Okay, correct.
All right. I have two other small changes on the recommendations I'd like to recommend that go to just issues of clarity. Under recommendation number 2, and I'm referring now to subset 6 here, we say verification of a vehicle's watertight condition. in the water at the outset of each waterborne departure, I believe would give greater clarity there. It does not change the intent of the recommendation so far as I can determine, but clarity. And then on number 3, referring to the issue of canopies, where canopies have been removed on amphibious vessels for which there is no reserve buoyancy, require that all passengers don life jackets. And I think, again, that speaks to the issue that we intended there. Is that correct? Yes.
Just one question. That was an attempt to pull out of recommendation number 2, the first caveat, which was removal of canopies.
Mhm.
So it probably wouldn't hurt just to look at in changing recommendation 2. Do we want to keep the same "where canopies have been removed" phrase in recommendation 3, or modify it to take into account the revised wording of the first part of recommendation 2?
In other words, if I'm understanding, Rob, then what we would want on the revision we just discussed on number 2, subset 1, it would read removal of canopies for waterborne operations or installation of a Coast Guard approved canopy. And here I'm needing some help on wordsmithing, because I think you have a clause that we still need to keep that does not restrict either horizontal or vertical escape by passengers in the event of seeking 4 vehicles in which there is no reserve buoyancy. Would that be the final?
Chairman Blake, if I
Yes.
could offer a suggestion. For number 3,
Mhm.
if you say where canopies have been removed on amphibious passenger vehicles for which there is no reserve buoyancy as recommended in recommendation 2, number 1,
Okay.
require that all passengers don life jackets before beginning waterborne operations.
If I could still raise the point, though, that implies that if you haven't removed your canopy and you have an accepted Coast Guard canopy that meets the vertical and horizontal requirements, then we're saying you don't need to wear a life jacket?
Why don't we say removed or modified on amphibious passenger vehicles? Wouldn't that cover the concern? Because that would be, a modified canopy would be a Coast Guard approved one, I would guess.
I think that's what we would want to say, that under both those conditions, you still need to wear a life jacket.
Yeah.
It does seem to me, though, that if we assume that the vessels are inherently dangerous, then we need to wear life jackets. But where safeguards have been put in place to manage the characteristics of ducks, to make them safe for passenger operations, that would seem to make requiring life jackets a moot issue.
The assumption that and now as I'm looking at this, I think perhaps that this is something we do need to be clear about. Number 3 then is, for the canopies, essentially the recommendation of staff then is that unless there is a canopy in place, whether the vehicle has adequate reserve buoyancy or not, we would still like to see them required to have life jackets on board. And not on board, I'm sorry, require that passengers wear them. Is that correct? So again, this is a...
If there is adequate reserve buoyancy, staff would not be proposing that the passengers have to wear life jackets. This particular recommendation was made with the concern that we would not want passengers to don life jackets if there is a canopy overhead that could entrap them.
Yes.
So clearly you understand that. But yes, if a vehicle has adequate reserve buoyancy,
Would not recommend.
we would not recommend that they have to wear life jackets because they would already be afloat and would remain in that condition. So.
All right, so then going back to the edit that I detailed a few minutes ago, which is where canopies have been removed on amphibious passenger vehicles for which there is no reserve buoyancy or not adequate reserve buoyancy would be correct. Is that? So we do, with that change we are making, and then is there still a staff concern here that we're not speaking to?
Yes, there is. It seems to me that this espouses a strategy to force operators to become, as we desire, to have reserve buoyancy. And I don't think, as the ducks stand right now, that many others in operation, that the condition of the ducks actually requires that the passengers wear life jackets, whether they have a canopy or not. My thesis is that ducks have been made fairly safe, and based on their safe operating record, there's no support for actually wearing life jackets.
I think Mr. Woody is raising a broader issue than the question of editing the recommendation to get the recommendation to say what it is we mean. And the issue between Mr. Woody's viewpoint and what I would guess to be the viewpoint of the majority of staff, and which is my own, is that the issue with the ducks is that they are a uniquely vulnerable vessel. And so what we intended to suggest through recommendation 2 was that if you don't add the reserve buoyancy, there are elements of redundancy that you need to build into making it an adequately safe vessel. Recommendation 3 would actually have been part of recommendation 2, but for the fact that it has this very unique side effect, which is you don't want it if you still have the canopy. So we look at recommendation 3 really as a sort of subset of 2. We are looking for a series of redundant safety measures, all to be in place in the absence of reserve buoyancy. And so to the degree that Mr. Woody has an objection, it's a philosophical objection really to much of the approach that we have. As to the editing issue, I think if we simply accept the recommendation of the chairman, that we will have gotten 95% of the way, and it might not be a good idea to put in the issue of modification, because depending upon how that modification is made, you may still have the issue of floating somebody into the canopy too quickly. And so without knowing that, you're probably better off just accepting the notion that we need to make explicit that it is where canopies have been removed and there is no reserve buoyancy that we would make this requirement.
I would certainly take that point. All right, and we appreciate the fact that staff are not all of like minds in the case of this report, and we appreciate the candor of all of you here in providing your best counsel. Are there other comments on this at this point?
Madam Chairman, if I might, I apologize for one more edit. I recognize that it has been stated there's no reserve buoyancy, but actually what we're looking for is adequate reserve buoyancy. So I would suggest there is not adequate reserve buoyancy.
All right.
Thank you.
I think that's helpful. Thank you. All right. Are there other issues or suggested edits here? All right. If not, and if we all feel we have clarity on the edits that have been made here, if anyone would like any reiterated, I'd be happy to do it. But otherwise, I would entertain a motion to adopt the recommendations as edited.
Excuse me, Chairman Blakey.
Yes.
On page 88, we've changed the status of some recommendations that I think needs to be considered before the board votes on recommendations.
Quite right. That I appreciate you pointing that out. Let me just mention this, that we do have a previously issued recommendation in this report, and let me just reiterate that if I might too, so that everyone's aware that we are certainly including that in. The following safety recommendation was issued to 30 operators and refurbishers of amphibious passenger vehicles in the United States. Without delay, alter your amphibious passenger vehicles to provide reserve buoyancy through passive means, such as watertight compartmentalization, built-in flotation, or equivalent measures, so that they will remain afloat and upright in the event of flooding, even when carrying a full complement of passengers and crew. Based on information received, the Safety Board classifies in this report Safety Recommendation M005, previously classified open acceptable, to closed acceptable action for one company, and that is the company Cool Stuff. And then, based on the lack of response to our initial letter and our follow-up letter of August 17, 2000, the Safety Board classifies Safety Recommendation M005 open unacceptable response to the following companies and we list a group there. I won't read them all, but they are contained in the report. So that is clarity on where we stand on that. But I would ask the board to include the previously issued recommendation as a part of those that we are moving forward again today. All right. I believe I did have a motion to move the recommendations of this report as
Oh.
edited.
I just see Marjorie trying to, excuse me.
I'm sorry, Marjorie.
Yes, there's also recommendation 4, Madam Chairman.
Did I overlook that? My apologies.
Perhaps I didn't hear you read it. I
It's
didn't
to the-
recall.
To the Coast Guard, U.S. Coast Guard, number 4, develop and promulgate guidance for all amphibious passenger vehicles similar in purpose to the Navigation and Vehicle Inspection Circular 1-01.
And if I may have one more item of clarification, the edit that John Hammerschmidt offered on recommendation 2, subparagraph 1, is to be considered now as you vote.
It is. I did not hear any move on the part of our board members to consider it separately, so we will include that as a part of the overall recommendations unless I hear otherwise. And as I say, I ask if anyone needed reiteration of any of these, and I believe we have clarity on that. We have looked at the text here at the table. All right. With that in mind, a motion to adopt and a second. All those in favor of accepting the recommendations as edited, please say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? They are unanimously adopted. At this point, I'd like to move then, if I could, to the report as a whole. Yes.
Sorry, Madam Chairman, the probable causes for the 2 briefs, is that?
I was going to move those separately after, but I'd be happy to do that first if that would be more helpful. If you'd like me to, I will go to that first. The probable cause for the 2 briefs, and I'm going to have to find those here.
Page 99.
Thank you.
For the minnow, and page 105, I believe, for the duck.
Thank you. I will now read the probable cause for the minnow. The National Transportation Safety Board determines that the probable cause of the flooding and sinking of the minnow was the inadequate pre-purchase mechanical evaluation and subsequent inadequate maintenance by Minnow Tours before placing the vessel in passenger service. Would it be helpful for me to ask for a vote on these separately, or can they be moved as a part of the overall report? Ron?
I would vote on them separately. They'll be published as part of the overall report.
All right. Then before we move to the question of the overall report, could I have a motion to adopt the probable cause as written for the minnow? And a second?
Second.
All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. All opposed. Again, it is adopted unanimously. Thank you. And the edit we have. Thank you. All right. The probable cause for duck number 1 is the following. The National Transportation Safety Board determines that the probable cause of the flooding and sinking of duck number 1 was a missing access plug, which in turn was caused by inadequate supervision of company personnel and inadequate management oversight of amphibious passenger vehicle maintenance. Contributing to the sinking was a flaw in the design of the ducts, that is, the inadequate reserve buoyancy that would have allowed the vehicle to remain afloat in a flooded condition. We have made a already discussed edit on that last sentence, which would be contributing to the sinking was a flaw in the design of the ducts as converted for passenger use, that is, the inadequate reserve buoyancy that would have allowed the vehicle to remain afloat in a flooded condition. So with that edit on the probable cause for duck number 1, could I have a motion to approve as edited?
So moved.
And a second. All those in favor?
Aye.
It's approved unanimously. Now, are there any other actions that should be taken before we move the entire report? All right.
I might mention I have a few editorial suggestions I can give to staff. I did notice one in Appendix A, though, investigation in public forum, where we state the National Transportation Safety Board was notified of the Miss Majestic at 1700 on May 2nd, 1999. May 2nd?
It was the day after the accident before we were notified of the accident, sir. We found out about it actually through the comm center, our own comm center here, who saw it on television and notified us. And it was a day after the accident when we launched. Your recollection, sir, is different, apparently.
Well, we can discuss that afterwards, but I even reviewed my travel voucher, and it shows me departing on May 1st. Because I heard of the accident within just a very few hours of it happening, and called that in to Marine Division, someone. I heard from a relative of mine in Arkansas that something bad had happened on Lake Hamilton. So apparently we need to get our ducks in a row on that. So, but I did. That did not. As soon as I read that, it kind of jumped up at me. I said, "What?" And so I guess you need to research that a little bit, pin that down.
Well, if there are small edits or changes that still need to be, I trust the staff will be able to adopt those. I had also a few typos, which I'll pass on to you. But, before moving the entire report, I do want to extend real gratitude to the staff. A great deal of work went into this. I know this has been a long process, and I think we're all very appreciative of the fact that this was a multifaceted accident with a lot of issues that really raised unusual challenges from that standpoint. So I certainly want to make that comment at this point, because getting it all right, I know, has been a real goal here, and I know everyone has tried very hard from that standpoint. If there are any other comments, otherwise I'd like to, as I say, move the report.
Just say I thought that was a very nice presentation this morning of the accident investigation.
I have a question, Madam Chair.
Yes.
I guess it goes to Mr. Patachi. I haven't decided this yet, but in the event I want to put a concurring statement with this, what is the time frame for me being required to do so, since we have put so many restrictive timetables on the board?
I'm not sure. Without consulting the order, I'm not sure. But I would certainly think it would be a reasonable time. Dan Campbell suggests 2 o'clock.
To be determined.
Please let me know.
Okay, I'll look at that.
All right, we will now vote on adopting the report as a whole. Is there a motion to adopt the report as revised?
So moved.
And a second. All those in favor?
Aye.
The report is adopted. Again, thanks to the staff. We appreciate this. Given we are breaking later certainly than might be desirable for lunch, but nevertheless, I'll ask folks to, if they could, reassemble back here at 2:45, where we will then take up the rail report. Thank you very much.